Mr. Campbell, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Lockhart. There is a Bloomberg report out today about a letter from then SEC Chairman Christopher Cox, written to you, I guess, in January of this year, with a number of subjects, I guess, including suggestions that perhaps Fannie and Freddie are being encouraged to make loans that might not be in the best interest of the profitability of that entity or something. Are you familiar with this letter?
We don't really comment on correspondence from board members, but I can tell you that, and Chairman Cox was a member of the new board that was created out of HERA. I can tell you that we worked closely with Chairman Cox over the 3 years that I was at FAO and now FHFA. He was very involved actually in the Fannie fines that we did right about 3 years ago. The issue that, as reported, and I will comment on the issue as reported in the Bloomberg article, and the issue I think is, if you want to sum it up, is does modifying mortgages and refinancing them cause damage to Fannie and Freddie? And my view, as I think I said earlier, they sit on $5.4 trillion of mortgages. That mortgage book is so large and so important that what they can do to stabilize the market will be good. Now, one of the problems is, from an accounting standpoint, when you modify a loan, they have to take it out of their mortgage-backed securities and they have to write it down as if it wasn't modified. And so there's a large deduction. So there's a short-term cost. But my view is that if it goes into foreclosure, the cost will be worse on that mortgage, but more importantly, it'll be worse in the neighborhood and it'll be worse for their $5.4 trillion book. So the view I have had, and I share it with the management of Fannie and Freddie, is that their number one job at the moment is to help try to stabilize the mortgage market.
Even if that, maybe in the short term or whatever, is not the best thing for the financial result of Fannie and Freddie?
It's really a very short-term negative on the financial result because they get to take this back in. And in fact, that accounting is going to change January 1st of next year with the consolidation of all their mortgage-backed securities. So it's an extremely short-term effect. And some of that actually may be written back.
Let me ask you, Director Lockhart, if I can, could we, members of this committee, see this letter?
I don't think that's appropriate, but I will check with my lawyers.
Okay, yeah, because I don't, Mr. Chairman?
I think it was an SEC letter, so it may be better to ask the SEC, in fact.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, there was a letter written from then SEC Chairman Christopher Cox to Director Lockhart in January, and so that's something I think the committee members should be able to see. And I'll just say I would have a hard time understanding why members of the committee, given that the Fannie and Freddie are under receivership, conservatorship, sorry, you're correct, my bad, would not be allowed to see this letter. But I would hope that the chairman of the committee would support that position.
I can tell you this letter has been discussed with the new board at the first meeting of the new board as the new secretaries came in, and we've gone through the contents, and we're continuing to look at those issues, and we'll continue to work through those issues. Again, as we work with the board members, it is an advisory board, and they've been very helpful, and I think it's very useful to have that kind of dialogue, but I think to the extent that dialogue gets out into the public, it's not as helpful, and we may not have as much dialogue in the future.
Very confidential letter. The only people that I know that have it are the press.
I guess that probably makes my point for me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that since we have an oversight responsibility, we should be seeing that letter. But another question is that I believe the SEC, I think your belief, sir, is that we have about $150 billion in risky, that Fannie and Freddie have about $150 billion in risky outstanding mortgages, but the SEC believes that it's closer to $1.7 trillion. How how do you reconcile that difference, or why do they feel it's so dramatically higher than I believe, if I have the numbers right, that you believe?
I don't know where the 150 came from. It might be that they have about 170 billion in private label securities, which are risky. There's no doubt about it. But they also have the rest of their book, which is well over $5 trillion, and there's obviously higher risk mortgages in that book. There's some subprime, not a lot, but Alt-A mortgages, interest-only mortgage, option arms. There's a series of things.
That add up to about...
They don't add up to 1.7 trillion. The SEC sort of double counted some of the mortgages. The numbers, I would say, is about 1.4 of the 5.4.
Okay. I believe, I'd love to ask more questions, but I believe well, then I'll ask the question we discussed earlier. It's my understanding that some of the early default rates, first payment default, that sort of thing, on loans made since the first of the year, so in other words, long after we knew about this crisis, at Fannie and Freddie, are equivalent to some default rates that were done before all of the subprime stuff kind of became out there. Is that true? And if so, is that part of the strategy of helping the housing market by continuing to make loans to subprime and other lower qualified buyers and lower underwriting standards?
It does no one any good, and I think it's one of the lessons we really learned in the last 2 years, to make a loan that we think they're going to default on, or Fannie and Freddie think that they're going to default on. It hurts the individual, it hurts the neighborhood, it's just terrible. So it's certainly not part of the strategy to make loans that we think that Fannie and Freddie think there's going to be defaults on. Fannie and Freddie have tightened their credit standards over the last year and since the conservatorship, and they, and frankly, they have gotten grief from many groups for doing that, but I think it is appropriate. You have to take a balanced look at the credit, but it certainly does no one any good to make a loan that someone's going to default.
Do you know what the first payment default rate is?
I don't have the number in front of me. I can provide it to you. It's not only a function of the loan, but it's a function of the economy, and it also can, as I told you earlier, it can be a function that the underwriting was poorly done, and in that case, Fannie and Freddie have the right to return it to the financial institution that sold it to them.
Thank you for your forbearance there, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield on that question?
I'm happy to yield whatever time the chairman will allow me to have.
Maybe, actually, it would be, along the analogy that there may be some costs involved short-term on some of the aspects of things, but the long-term, the overall goal, overarching goal is to stabilize the marketplace. Maybe it's not a bad thing. From that analysis, it may not be a bad thing to say we're going to underwrite loans on rates at terms that aren't necessarily likely to get paid back, because it will prop up the economy over the long term. I'm just...
Not sure I
again,
agree, but
Congressman, a default doesn't help anybody, and it certainly doesn't help individuals, neighborhoods, and
particularly a first payment default if
Right.
if that information that I have is correct.